In the remote hills of eastern Oregon, beneath more than a century of silence, lies a truth so dark that local authorities buried it along with the victims. Between 1852 and 1888, over 800 pioneers vanished along a 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail. Not to disease, not to accidents, but to something far more sinister. At the heart of it all stood the Sacred Heart Chapel, a modest wooden church that promised salvation to dying travelers. But behind its weathered walls unfolded one of the most methodical mass murder schemes in American frontier history. What started as isolated disappearances soon became a cold, organized enterprise. The Grayson family didn't just kill for money, they perfected it. They kept meticulous records of every life taken, every family destroyed, every dream buried in the shallow graves that still lie beneath Oregon soil. Before we descend into this darkness, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone. If you are one of the few brave enough to confront America's most disturbing hidden truths, subscribe now and tell me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories others are too afraid to tell. Now, let's go back to 1852, a time when the Oregon Trail stretched like a lifeline across the frontier, carrying the dreams of thousands toward the west. Each mile meant both hope and danger. Disease, starvation, and natural disasters claimed countless lives. But in the rolling hills of eastern Oregon, death wore a different face, one that smiled with Christian compassion while quietly weighing the value of family's possessions. Father Morai Grayson founded the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851, a simple wooden structure overlooking a common resting place for wagon trains. To weary pioneers, it was a beacon of hope, a place to pray, to rest, to bury their dead. Morai, a tall, gaunt man with piercing gray eyes, presented himself as a missionary called to serve the westward-bound faithful. His wife, Sister Constance, played the role of healer, tending to sick children and grieving mothers. And then there was Brother Ezekiel, Morai's younger brother, skilled with livestock tools and just about anything a desperate traveler might need. Together, they formed a perfect illusion of Christian charity. They offered medicine, repairs, and shelter, exactly what travelers needed when they were too weak to go on. Their chapel had a curious feature, an unusually large basement, which the Graysons claimed was for storing food and supplies for destitute travelers. Their remote location meant there were few witnesses, and most locals praised the family's devotion. Who else, after all, would dedicate their lives to caring for strangers in the middle of nowhere? The first disappearance came on September 23rd, 1852, but no one would connect the dots until decades later. Pregnant Elizabeth Morrison, her 3 children, and her elderly father had broken away from a larger wagon train, convinced they could finish the journey alone. When their wagon axle snapped just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it felt like divine providence. James Morrison would later be quoted in territorial records as saying the chapel appeared like a gift from the Almighty when he first saw it from the ridge. Within hours, Brother Ezekiel appeared, as if summoned by fate. "The Lord has placed you near our humble chapel for a reason," he said in his slow, deliberate voice. "Your Elizabeth looks ready to deliver. Father Morai will gladly offer you sanctuary while you make repairs." Grateful and relieved, the Morrisons accepted the invitation and moved into the small cabin near the chapel, a cabin the Graysons kept ready for weary travelers. For 3 days, life seemed peaceful. Sister Constance tended to Elizabeth with kindness. Ezekiel helped James repair the wagon. Father Morai prayed with the family, offering comfort for the hard miles behind them. The children played in the yard, and Elizabeth's father, Samuel, enjoyed the quiet rocking chair on the porch. But on the 4th day, the tone shifted. Samuel fell suddenly ill, stomach cramps, nausea, weakness. Sister Constance called it trail sickness, and prepared what she called her blessed remedies from herbs stored in the chapel's basement. "The Lord provides healing through nature's bounty," she said softly, mixing the concoction. "But sometimes the body must purge itself of its toxins before the healing begins." Within hours, Samuel's condition worsened. His skin turned gray, his breathing became labored, and violent vomiting followed. James wanted to ride east of the trading post for help, but Father Morai placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Brother James, I have seen this many times," he said gravely. "Moving him now would surely kill him. We must trust in the Lord's timing." By the 6th day, 7-year-old Tommy was sick. Then 5-year-old Mary. Sister Constance stayed by their side day and night, giving more of her remedies, her expression one of saintly devotion. But the truth was anything but holy. The remedies were laced with carefully measured doses of arsenic, a poison the Graysons secretly obtained from nearby mining operations. The symptoms mimicked natural trail diseases perfectly, making the deaths appear tragically ordinary to grieving families. Samuel died on the 7th day, Tommy on the 9th, Mary on the 11th. Each death was followed by a solemn funeral service at the chapel. Father Morai's words were so moving that James and Elizabeth thanked the Graysons for their compassion, never suspecting that the very people comforting them were their murderers. At night, while the exhausted parents wept and prayed, Brother Ezekiel searched their belongings and carefully cataloged every item of value. The Morrisons were prosperous. Their wagon contained fine furniture, quality tools, family heirlooms, and gold coins hidden in James's clothing. On the 12th day, James himself fell ill. Elizabeth, heavily pregnant and terrified, begged Sister Constance to save him. "My dear child," the woman said gently, holding Elizabeth's shaking hands. "Some illnesses are simply the Lord calling his children home. Your husband will soon join your precious babies in paradise." James died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth. The newborn survived only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai. 3 days later, Elizabeth succumbed as well. In less than 3 weeks, the entire Morrison family was gone. To anyone who asked, the Graysons had a ready explanation. The family had arrived sick and exhausted from the trail, fallen victim to a virulent dysentery, and died despite the Graysons' best efforts. No one ever suspected that their deaths were part of something much darker, the beginning of a pattern that would claim hundreds of lives over the next 3 decades. To the outside world, the Graysons looked like selfless Christian caregivers, risking their lives to comfort the sick and bury the dead. Father Morai performed solemn funerals, gave proper Christian burials, and spoke movingly about sacrifice and salvation. The grieving survivors never suspected that when Morai said their loved one's possessions had been consecrated to the Lord's work, it was simply a pious-sounding euphemism for theft. But the Morrison family was only the beginning. The Graysons had made a discovery that would shape the next 3 decades of their lives and turn that quiet chapel into a slaughterhouse. They learned that murder, when planned carefully and cloaked in religion, could be not only undetectable, but extraordinarily profitable. The Morrison case taught them everything they needed to know. Isolated families were safer targets than large groups. Arsenic poisoning perfectly mimicked trail illnesses, giving them a cover story no one questioned. And most importantly, the Oregon Trail was an endless river of victims. Families could disappear in the wilderness, and no one would notice for months, if ever. Letters back east took half a year to arrive, if they arrived at all, and most relatives assumed the worst when a family went silent. Disease, Indian attacks, starvation. There were countless excuses for why someone never made it to Oregon. Over the next several months, the Graysons refined their operation into something terrifyingly efficient. Brother Ezekiel became the scout. He would ride out miles ahead of the chapel, watching for promising targets. Families traveling alone, wagons heavy with goods, the sick and the struggling. Sister Constance perfected her craft. She experimented with doses, testing which amount of arsenic worked fastest, which produced slower, more believable illness, and which left no trace. She learned to slip poison into herbal teas, into medicinal tonics, even into the communion wine itself, a chilling perversion of the sacrament. Father Morai honed his manipulation. He became an expert at reading a family's faith background and using it to hold them in place even as their loved ones were dying. For Methodists, he preached divine healing and urged prayer. For Presbyterians, he spoke of predestination and God's mysterious plan. For Baptist, he focused on personal salvation and the hope of heavenly reunion. The chapel itself was altered to suit their dark work. The basement was expanded, divided into rooms, one for storing victims' possessions, one for preparing poison, and one that served as a grim temporary morgue. Behind the chapel, in a grove of trees, they dug rows of unmarked graves, a secret cemetery that would one day hold hundreds. The winter of 1852 to 1853 was a time of preparation. With the trail quiet, they inventoried the Morrison family's belongings, selling what they could through black market traders in nearby settlements. Ezekiel proved particularly skilled at this. His open, honest face made him convincingly claim to be selling goods on behalf of families who returned east or those who died of fever. He spaced out sales across multiple towns to avoid suspicion, carefully matching goods to the right buyers. Fine furniture to wealthy settlers, tools to farmers, gold and jewelry to trusted merchants. By spring 1853, the Graysons were no longer amateur killers. They were professionals, predators who had solved every problem: victim selection, method of death, body disposal, and profit. Their public image as pious caregivers made them untouchable. That spring brought new victims. In May, the Graysons met the Hoffman family, German immigrants with a wagon full of tools, textiles, and gold coins, the sum of their life savings. They spoke little English, which made them easy to control, and their foreign customs made them seem strange to other travelers, isolating them even more. When the Hoffman wagon broke down near the chapel, the Graysons seized the opportunity. But this time, Sister Constance didn't wait for illness to appear naturally. She began poisoning them almost immediately. Sister Constance presented her remedies to the Hoffman family as preventive medicine, a blessed protection against trail diseases. Heinrich Hoffman, in his broken English, clasped her hands and said, "My God, you are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for this." "God has already blessed us," she replied with a soft smile, "by giving us the opportunity to serve as children in their time of need." The murder of the Hoffmans took nearly a month. This slower pace allowed the Graysons to carefully catalog every item in the family's wagon, plan how to dispose of their clockmaking tools, and quietly observe the family's daily habits. Information that would make future killings even easier. By the end of 1853, 3 entire families, 16 souls, had been erased from existence. The Graysons no longer thought of themselves as desperate killers. They now saw themselves as running an enterprise, one that required careful planning, record-keeping, and refinement. Father Morai began keeping ledgers in his precise, almost elegant handwriting. Each entry read like a business account. Morrison family, 5 souls departed September, October 1852. Possessions, gold coins 2, furniture, tools. Burial, Grove, Section C. Estimated profit, $400. Method, arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration, 17 days. Lessons, reduce dosage frequency to extend timeline and reduce suspicion. These records, discovered decades later, hidden in compartments beneath the chapel floor, would horrify investigators. They revealed that to the Graysons, human lives were just inventory, as were the chapel's charity spread. Families began seeking them out. Desperate pioneers would deliberately stop at the Sacred Heart Chapel, walking willingly into the trap. The Graysons' operation had become so polished that they no longer waited for victims. They attracted them. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point. That was when the Weather family arrived. Charles Weather, a former Confederate officer from Tennessee, was traveling west with his wife Margaret, their 15-year-old twin daughters, Sarah and Susan, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith with a full set of tools. They were exactly the kind of prize the Graysons wanted, wealthy, well-equipped, carrying gold and jewelry hidden in a secret compartment in their wagon. But they were also alert, intelligent, and suspicious. Unlike any family the Graysons had faced before, when their wagon broke near the chapel, Brother Ezekiel appeared as usual, offering help. But Charles didn't trust him. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles said, his eyes scanning the lonely chapel and surrounding hills, "but we can handle our own repairs. We'll be moving on directly." Morai didn't push. Instead, he planted a seed. "My brother," he said, his voice calm, almost sympathetic, "Sister Constance has seen signs of sickness nearby, possibly cholera or dysentery. You might wish to remain here a few days, at least until you know your family is safe." It was a masterstroke. Margaret weathered protective instincts overpowered her husband's suspicions. When young David developed a mild fever the next day, a fever Sister Constance assured them was an early symptom of a disease. Margaret begged Charles to stay until David recovered. Charles reluctantly agreed, but he never let his guard down. Unlike the Graysons' previous victims, the Weatherbys were not passive. Charles kept watch, asked pointed questions about the chapel, about the other families buried in the graveyard, about the Graysons' past. The family's skepticism forced the Graysons to adapt. Father Morai became more careful, crafting elaborate stories about the dozens of lives they had saved. He walked Charles through the cemetery, pointing to fresh graves and speaking solemnly about travelers who had arrived already too sick to be saved. Everything was designed to convince Charles that the Graysons were harmless, that they were God's servants. But behind the scenes, Sister Constance was already preparing the first dose of poison. Father Morai's strategy was patient and precise. He showed Brother Charles forged testimonial letters from grateful families who, according to the documents, had recovered from illness under the Graysons' care and reached Oregon safely. One evening, as the two men sat on the chapel porch in the fading light, Morai spoke in a calm, almost confessional tone. "Brother Charles, I understand your caution. A man who has served his country learns to trust carefully. But consider this. If we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Will we not choose easier prey than a soldier with weapons and watchful eyes?" The words worked like a key in a lock. By acknowledging Charles's military background, Morai fed his pride and lowered his guard. By suggesting that Charles would be a difficult target, he made the very idea of being targeted seem absurd. Most importantly, Morai's quiet, open manner gave the illusion of honesty. The murder of the Weather family took 6 slow, methodical weeks, the longest killing timeline the Graysons had ever attempted. Sister Constance started with the smallest possible doses of arsenic, added to water she claimed had been blessed to prevent disease. The poison worked so gradually that the first symptoms looked like a natural sickness. David, young and frail, was the first to die. His passing seemed to confirm Sister Constance's dire warnings, and the family's grief only deepened their gratitude toward their supposed saviors. Margaret was next, falling sick soon after David's burial, a decline that Constance blamed on exhaustion and heartbreak. But Charles, the soldier, began to notice a pattern. Why were he and his daughters untouched by the sickness? Why did the worst symptoms always seem to occur when the Graysons were nearby? His suspicions hardened the night. He caught Brother Ezekiel rummaging through the wagon. Ezekiel claimed he was checking for animal damage, a reasonable excuse, but Charles could feel danger closing in. "Margaret," he whispered to his fever-stricken wife at dawn, "we need to leave this place. Something isn't right here." But she was too weak to travel, and moving her would kill her faster. Charles remained torn until a chance discovery in the chapel basement removed all doubt. Searching for supplies, he found a hidden compartment stuffed with possessions that could only belong to other travelers. A child's doll, a man's engraved pocket watch, and, most damning of all, an unsent letter addressed to Oregon City. The letter spoke of arriving at the chapel and thanking God for the Christian family, caring for her children, a letter that should have been delivered but never left this place. Charles knew then. The Graysons were murderers and his family had been marked for death. But the revelation came too late. Margaret died that night. When Charles awoke the next morning, he felt the first familiar cramps and weakness. A massive dose of poison had been slipped into his evening meal. As he lay dying, his twin daughters by his side, Charles tried to warn them, to run, to escape the chapel while they still could. But his words, slurred and fevered, sounded like the ravings of a delirious man. The girls remained under the Graysons' care, and under their poison. The weather case became a lesson plan for the killers. They learned that suspicious victims required more elaborate manipulation, that longer murder timelines, while riskier, created the illusion of natural illness and increased profit. That suspicion had to be detected early and dealt with quickly, sometimes with a sudden, fatal dose. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people from 7 families. They burned evidence, melted jewelry, and buried all traces of their victims in hidden graves. And, chillingly, they stopped seeing themselves as murderers. In their minds, they were now divine instruments, rewarded by God with the wealth of those they relieved of suffering. But their confidence would soon be tested. In 1855, the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio would lead to the first serious crack in their operation, a survivor who saw too much, and the terrifying possibility of discovery. Thomas Patterson was a successful merchant who had sold off his Ohio business to seek new opportunities in Oregon's growing economy. He traveled with his wife, Emily, their 4 children, and Emily's sister, Catherine, an unmarried woman in her 30s who served as the family's teacher and watchful guardian. The Patterson family wasn't just wealthy, they were respectable, the kind of people whose disappearance would raise questions back home. That made them both an attractive prize and a dangerous risk for the Graysons, a challenge that appealed to Father Morai's growing sense of invincibility. The family's wagon train had broken apart near the Blue Mountains, leaving them traveling alone when Brother Ezekiel appeared like an apparition from the wilderness. "Good afternoon, friend," Ezekiel called, his tone warm and disarming. "That's a fine team of oxen you've got. Say, would your family be interested in fresh supplies? The chapel just ahead keeps a good stock." Thomas, cautious by nature, hesitated. Something about Ezekiel felt too smooth, too eager. "We appreciate the offer," Thomas said evenly, "but we're well supplied. We'll be moving on." Ezekiel only smiled as though expecting this answer. Of course," he said. "But perhaps I should mention, Sister Constance, our medical woman, has been treating several cases of mountain fever. Nasty stuff. Folks often don't even know they're infected until it's too late to travel safely. She's got remedies that can stop it before it takes hold." That one phrase, mountain fever, was enough to sway Emily. She turned sharply to Thomas, worry etched across her face. "If there's sickness in the area, we should at least hear what she has to say." The children. Thomas's resistance weakened under the weight of his wife's fear. He told himself they'd just speak with the healer, get a second opinion, then move on quickly. He didn't know he had just walked his family into the Graysons' trap. At the chapel, Father Morai charmed Thomas with talk of business and trade routes. Sister Constance disarmed Emily with gentle words and motherly warmth. Brother Ezekiel played with the children, showing off tricks and frontier skills. Within hours, the Pattersons felt like guests rather than strangers. That night they agreed to stay, just to be safe. The next morning, Sister Constance examined the family and, predictably, found early symptoms that required her immediate remedies. Catherine, ever dutiful, was the first to take the medicine. But Catherine was not a fool. She had an analytical mind and sharp memory, and over the next 2 days, she began to notice details that troubled her. She saw Brother Ezekiel taking inventory of their wagon at dusk. When she mentioned this to Sister Constance, she received a calm but carefully prepared explanation. "Oh, Brother Ezekiel checks everyone's possessions," Constance said smoothly. "We'd had theft before. We just want to make sure nothing goes missing while you're under our care." The excuse was reasonable, but Catherine's unease grew. She noticed how Father Morai's eyes lingered on Thomas's gold watch a moment too long. How Constance always prepared her remedies in private, never letting anyone see the process. How every family member who took the medicine seemed to grow sicker, not better. Everything came to a head on the 4th day. Catherine entered the infirmary quietly and caught Sister Constance sprinkling a fine white powder into the medicine meant for young Timothy. "What is that?" Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Constance's serene face flickered with something hard, almost hostile, before she smiled again. "Blessed salt," she said sweetly. "It strengthens the healing properties of the herbs." But Catherine's father had been a pharmacist. She knew what salt crystals looked like, and these were not salt. That night, Catherine made her decision. She faked drinking her dose and spat it into a handkerchief. She convinced Timothy to play along, turning it into a secret game. Within 2 days, the pattern became undeniable. Thomas, Emily, and the 3 older children grew weaker. Catherine and Timothy stayed healthy. Catherine's dread hardened into certainty. The Graysons were poisoning them. On the 6th day, she began secretly rationing food, planning for escape, even as she smiled politely at her hosts, pretending to be the grateful guest they expected her to be. Children were already dead. Thomas lay barely breathing, his skin gray and clammy, and Emily, though pale and shaking, was still conscious enough to speak. Catherine sat by her sister's side, knowing this might be their last chance to talk. "Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I think these people are poisoning us. I think they've been killing our family from the moment we got here." Emily stared at her, shock flashing into anger. "No," she said, weakly shaking her head. "They've cared for us, fed us, tended us. They can't be murderers." But Catherine spoke quickly, urgently, listing everything she had seen: Ezekiel prowling their wagon, Constance hiding her remedies, the pattern of sickness that only struck those who drank the medicine. And as Emily listened, her disbelief began to crumble. Horror dawned on her face. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Thomas is dying. The children," her throat caught, "the children are gone. We can't even stand without help." Catherine's answer was steady, though her hands were shaking. "Then we leave. Tonight, even if it kills us on the road. Because if we stay, they will finish what they started. And we have to take Timothy. He's the only one who hasn't been poisoned yet." Her plan was desperate and almost impossible, but it was the only chance they had. In the dead of night, Catherine roused Emily and the boy. They slipped out of the cabin like shadows. Thomas was too weak to move, the older children already beyond saving. Catherine's heart shattered as she closed the door behind her, knowing she was leaving half her family to die. At the wagon, Catherine retrieved the gold and supplies she had hidden days earlier. Just as she was loading the last bundle, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the chapel. "Quick," she hissed, "under the canvas. Now!" Timothy and Emily crawled into wagon bed and hid beneath the cover, trembling. Catherine stayed outside, forcing her breathing to stay calm. Out of the darkness came Father Morai. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp as a knife. "Sister Catherine," he said softly, almost kindly, "you should be resting. Mountain fever clouds a judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine said, forcing her voice to stay level. "I was worried for Thomas and the children." Morai studied her in silence, and Catherine felt the air thicken around them. He was deciding whether she knew too much. Finally, he smiled. "Perhaps Sister Constance should prepare something stronger for you, a special remedy to help you sleep more peacefully." Catherine's blood turned to ice. He was going to kill her. "That's very kind," she said evenly, "but I'd rather try to sleep naturally." Morai's hand moved towards something hidden under his coat. "I'm afraid I must insist." What happened next would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. Before Morai could act, Emily appeared from behind the wagon, Thomas's pistol in her trembling hands. "Step away from my sister," she rasped. Her voice was weak, but her eyes blazed. Morai turned toward her, just for a moment, and that moment was enough. Catherine snatched up a heavy iron wrench from the wagon and swung with all her strength. The blow sent Morai staggering, not dead but stunned. "Go!" Catherine cried, scrambling into the driver's seat. Emily and Timothy stayed hidden as the wagon lurched forward. Behind them, Brother Ezekiel burst out of the chapel, shouting. Catherine cracked the whip, urging the oxen into a desperate run. The last thing she saw was Ezekiel sprinting toward the cabin, toward the bodies of her family. The escape was a blur of terror and grief. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering the names of her dead children. Catherine drove until her hands bled from the reins, her mind fixed only on putting as much distance as possible between them and the chapel. Timothy sat silently, staring at nothing, clutching Emily's hand. For 3 days they followed game trails through unfamiliar country, sleeping only in short snatches, always listening for pursuit. On the 4th day, when Catherine was near collapse, they stumbled across a military patrol from Fort Dallas. At first, the patrol leader thought Catherine was mad, her story too monstrous to be true. But she had proof: a vial of Constance's medicine, a pouch of the white powder, and Emily herself still suffering from arsenic's effects. The army sent men to investigate. What they found at the Sacred Heart Chapel turned Catherine's horror into history. Thomas and the children lay dead. The chapel basement was filled with crates of stolen possessions from dozens of murdered families, each item cataloged with chilling precision. And among Father Morai's papers, they discovered his ledger, a record of every death, every stolen fortune. The Pattersons, they learned, had been the Graysons' 37 family, had also refined their poisoning methods. Instead of relying solely on obvious doses of arsenic in medicines, they now use subtle, layered administration. Small amounts in multiple foods and drinks, combined with psychological manipulation to make victims appear cooperative and healthy while their bodies slowly deteriorated. Federal agents documented each interaction meticulously. Father Benedict Morai tailored his conversations to exploit each family member's fears and beliefs. Sister Mary Constance feigned constant care while secretly measuring precise doses, and Brother Thomas Ezekiel continued his careful inventory of possessions, now assisted by hired accomplices who ensured nothing was missed. It became chillingly clear that the Graysons had transformed their previous murderous enterprise into a full-scale, well-coordinated operation. Victim selection, wealthy or isolated families traveling alone or in small groups. Manipulation, exploitation of trust, religious belief, and exhaustion. Poisoning, arsenic and other toxins administered gradually and cleverly disguised. Theft, systematic cataloging, storage, and eventual sale of possessions. Operational security, new identities, accomplices, and strategically located charitable missions. The Henderson family, unaware of the deadly trap, were observed from concealed positions as they accepted shelter at the mission. The agents watched Father Benedict administer the first preventive treatment, noting the careful precision of Sister Mary's preparation and the subtle monitoring by Brother Thomas and his helpers. It was a replay, refined and more dangerous, of the horrors discovered at the Sacred Heart Chapel. Marshal Rise realized that the success of the operation depended on secrecy, deception, and absolute control over information. Unlike ordinary criminals, the Graysons had institutionalized murder as a process, combining religious authority, psychological manipulation, and logistical expertise. Any direct confrontation risked alerting them and allowing the killers to vanish once more. The federal team devised a careful plan. Their strategy would rely on simultaneous intervention, capturing all members of the Grayson operation at once while preserving evidence for prosecution. The stakes could not have been higher. Decades of murders, hundreds of victims, and sophisticated criminals who had evaded justice for years. It would take courage, patience, and unflinching attention to detail to finally end the Graysons' reign of terror. But thanks to Catherine Patterson's survival and testimony, authorities now had the blueprint for understanding the full extent of the operation, and the first real chance to bring the Graysons to justice. Frontier settlers who had encountered the Graysons under the guise of charity. Patterns emerged showing a calculated network of murder sites, strategically located along major travel routes, with methods refined over decades to maximize profit, reduce suspicion, and exploit human trust. The sheer scale was staggering. Hundreds of victims across multiple states, possessions cataloged and sold, and psychological manipulation perfected to the point that even intelligent, cautious travelers could be deceived. Investigators realized that the Graysons were not opportunistic killers, but architects of a trans-territorial criminal enterprise. Trial proceedings began later in 1857, drawing intense public attention. Survivors like Catherine Patterson and the Henderson family provided damning first-hand testimony, while recovered journals and ledgers offer meticulous proof of systematic murder, theft, and deception. The courtroom was presented not just with evidence of isolated crimes, but with an organized, premeditated operation that treated human lives as inventory and murder as a business process. Father Morai, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel were each confronted with survivors' testimonies, the recovered records, and forensic analysis confirming poisoning methods. Their defenses ranged from religious justification to claims of mercy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Morai's cold rationalizations, Sister Constance's lack of remorse, and Ezekiel's unwavering obedience painted a chilling portrait of a family whose morality had been entirely subverted by greed, cruelty, and calculated evil. The trial concluded with convictions on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and theft. Sentences were severe: life imprisonment for Morai and Constance, while Ezekiel received the death penalty for his role as executor of the family's murderous plans. The Graysons' network was dismantled, and surviving victims were compensated where possible, though the emotional and psychological scars endured for generations. The legacy of the Grayson family served as a grim warning to travelers and frontier communities. Evil could disguise itself behind the most virtuous facades, and vigilance was the only protection. Their case reshaped law enforcement practices in the Western Territories, emphasizing surveillance, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and skepticism of seemingly benevolent strangers. Ultimately, the exposure of the Graysons' crimes provided closure to the families they had destroyed, immortalized the bravery of survivors like Catherine Patterson, and underscored the terrifying reality that calculated, systematic evil could operate unnoticed, even in places supposedly protected by faith and community. Crimes lingered for generations. Communities along the frontier remained wary of strangers offering aid, and caution became a key survival strategy for travelers. The story of the Grayson family became a cautionary tale, retold in frontier settlements and among westward migrants as a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind pious appearances. The case also left a lasting imprint on legal precedent and investigative practices in the territories. Authorities began systematically documenting suspicious deaths, improving record sharing between jurisdictions, and applying forensic analysis to determine causes of death more rigorously. The meticulous records left by the Graysons, once a tool of their crimes, ironically became a model for evidence gathering and the importance of documentation in criminal investigations. For survivors like Catherine Patterson and Timothy, life after the ordeal was defined by vigilance and advocacy. Catherine dedicated herself to helping prevent others from falling victim to manipulative predators, while Timothy used his knowledge of the trails and the lessons from his childhood to protect families traveling through dangerous territories. Though their personal losses were irreplaceable, their courage and testimony ultimately brought justice and helped reform frontier safety practices. In the broader cultural memory, the Grayson family's crimes highlighted the vulnerability of human trust when exploited by cunning and ruthless individuals. Their story underscored the dark side of the frontier, where isolation, desperation, and faith could be weaponized, and served as a chilling lesson on the importance of skepticism, observation, and protective measures when navigating unknown or remote communities. Atmosphere and tone. The writing effectively evokes dread and unease while maintaining a historical narrative tone. Moral reflection. The discussion of the Graysons' self-righteousness and methodical evil adds psychological depth. Survivor focus. Highlighting Catherine Patterson and Timothy provides a human counterpoint to the horror and reinforces the story's emotional impact. Call to action. The ending encourages reflection and engagement, which is perfect for a YouTube audience or storytelling format. Suggestions for tightening and impact. Break up long paragraphs. Several sections could be split into smaller paragraphs to improve readability and pacing, especially for online or spoken narration. Sharpen some sentences for punch. For instance, the 800 people who died at the hands of the false missionaries represent a dark chapter in the story of westward expansion, could be slightly condensed to 800 people fell victim to the false missionaries, a dark, haunting chapter of westward expansion. Consider a closing hook. You could end with a striking, memorable line for viewers to linger on AAG. In the end, the Graysons teach us that evil often wears a mask of piety, and that vigilance could be the difference between life and death.